The moment Marcus Abbott slammed his fist onto Commissioner Gerald Holt's mahogany desk, every head in the Territorial Land Office turned. The sound cracked through the heavy morning air of Tucson like a pistol shot, rattling the ink bottles and sending a sheaf of papers sliding to the floor. Dust motes swirled in the slant of September light cutting through the grimy windows, and the two deputies standing near the door reached instinctively for their holsters. "That transfer carries a forged seal," Marcus said, his voice low and iron-hard, "and I will prove it today." Commissioner Gerald Holt sat perfectly still behind his desk, a wide man in a wool suit that cost more than most ranch hands earned in 3 months. His face was the color of old tallow, and his small eyes fixed on Marcus with an expression caught somewhere between contempt and fear. A thin smile worked its way onto his lips, but it never reached those eyes. "Mr. Abbott." Holt spread his soft hands on the desk as though presenting a gift. "You are standing in a federal office making a very serious accusation. I would choose your next words with exceptional care." Marcus did not choose his words with care. That had never been his particular talent. "You transferred 42,000 acres of the Cimarron grassland to the Consolidated Territorial Land Trust on August the 3rd of this year," Marcus said. "The transfer document bears the seal of the Office of the Surveyor General, but the Surveyor General was in Santa Fe on August the 3rd. I have a signed affidavit saying so, and I have a second affidavit from a man who watched a seal stamp get pressed onto that document in the back room of the Silver Crown Saloon on August the 2nd. The silence in the room was absolute. Then Holt's carefully arranged calm cracked just slightly at one corner, and Marcus Abbott, who had spent 34 years reading cattle, weather, and men, saw it happen. But to understand how a quiet cattleman from the high grasslands came to be standing in a government office with fire in his chest and forged documents in his hand, you had to go back 6 weeks, to the morning Ada Lawson arrived in Tucson on the eastbound Southern Pacific with a carpetbag, a sealed letter of recommendation, and absolutely no plan for what came next. Ada Lawson was 26 years old, and she had the look of a woman who had been fighting something for a very long time and had grown surprisingly good at it. She was not delicate in the way the fashion plates in the Eastern magazines described women. She was lean and straight-backed, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical knot and gray eyes that took in a room with the quick, cataloging intelligence of someone who had learned that details saved lives. She wore a blue cotton traveling dress that had been fine once, and was beginning to show the particular fatigue that comes from being the only good dress a woman owns. She stepped off the train onto the platform at Tucson on the 4th of August, 1883, blinked in the white blaze of the Arizona morning sun, and looked around with the controlled expression of a woman who absolutely would not show that she was frightened. She was looking for the office of a land attorney named Clement Briggs, who had been her mother's cousin by marriage, and who had written her 6 months ago saying he had a position as a clerk in his office if she could make her way west from Missouri. Clement Briggs had died of a fever in June, which Ada did not know until she arrived at his address on Congress Street and found a locksmith boarding up the windows. She stood on the boardwalk with her carpetbag and her letter of recommendation that was now addressed to a dead man, and she did what she had trained herself to do in difficult moments. She breathed, she thought, and she refused to cry. It was while she was standing there, very still and very composed, that Marcus Abbott rode past on a big roan gelding and happened to notice her. He noticed her because of the stillness. He would think later. Most people in distress moved. They paced or wrung their hands or looked wildly around for help. Ada Lawson stood absolutely still with her chin up and her eyes fixed on the middle distance, and there was something about that particular brand of controlled composure that caught at something in Marcus's chest like a hook. He reined the roan in and looked at the boarded-up windows and then at her. "Clement Briggs's office," he said. "Yes," she said without looking at him. "He died in June." "I know that now." Marcus stepped down from the saddle. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with the particular deep-weathered tan of someone who spent his days in high, open country. He had a strong jaw, dark hair going slightly silver at the temples, and hands that showed 20 years of hard work. He was 34, and he had the calm and the patience of a man who had spent long years alone with large animals and open sky and had made a kind of peace with silence. "Do you have people in Tucson?" he asked. "No," she said. "Work. I had a position with Mr. Briggs that no longer exists." He considered this. "Where are you staying?" "I have not yet determined that." He was quiet for a moment. "The Butterfield Hotel on Mayor Street is clean, and the proprietress is a decent woman. It will cost you $1.50 a week. Tell her Marcus Abbott sent you, and she will hold the rate." Ada Lawson finally looked at him. Those gray eyes assessed him with a directness that most women of her era would not have deployed on a strange man on a public street, and Marcus held that assessment steadily and without flinching. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because you are standing outside a dead man's office in the August heat in a town where you do not know anyone," Marcus said, and it seemed like the useful thing to do. He tipped his hat, remounted the roan, and rode on. Ada went to the Butterfield Hotel. Mrs. Evangeline Price, the proprietress, was indeed a decent woman, and she did indeed hold the rate, and she also, over the next several days, told Ada a great deal about Tucson and its people with the frank generosity of a woman who had been in a place long enough to know where all the hidden currents ran. "Marcus Abbott," Mrs. Price said one evening, setting a plate of corn bread on the table in the small sitting room she shared with her lodgers after supper, "owns the Cimarron ranch up in the grasslands north of here. His family has run cattle there for 11 years. His father came out from Texas in '72. The old man died in '79. Marcus runs it alone now. Good man. Stubborn as a boulder in a creek bed, but good." "He mentioned none of that," Ada said. "No, he wouldn't," Mrs. Price said, with the satisfied expression of someone confirming a long-held opinion. "That is the kind of man who does things without talking about them." Ada had, by the end of her first week in Tucson, secured a position as a copyist and records clerk at the Territorial Land Office, largely on the strength of her excellent handwriting and her ability to navigate a stack of disorganized legal documents with confident efficiency. The pay was modest. The work was detailed and often tedious. Ada was good at it. The land office was where the hidden currents of Tucson ran deepest and fastest, Ada discovered within her first 3 days. Commissioner Gerald Holt presided over it with the smooth, practiced confidence of a man who understood exactly what kind of power he held and had been using it for personal benefit for quite some time. He smiled at Ada when she was introduced, complimented her penmanship, and assigned her to the records room, where the transfer documents and survey filings were kept. Ada, who had survived the last several years on her own wits, read the situation with reasonable accuracy within a week. Something in that office was wrong. She could feel it the way you feel a warped floorboard before you see it, that slight wrong give under the foot that tells you the structure beneath is compromised. She started paying attention. She read what she copied. She noticed things. Meanwhile, Marcus Abbott came into Tucson every 10 days or so for supplies and banking, and on his third visit after their first meeting, he stopped by the land office on a routine matter regarding a grazing boundary survey for the Cimarron. Ada was the clerk who handled his paperwork. She looked up from the counter and recognized him immediately, and he recognized her, and there was a moment that lasted perhaps 2 seconds in which something passed between them that neither of them immediately named. "You found the Butterfield," he said. "Mrs. Price sends her regards," Ada said, which was not true but which she felt was probably what Mrs. Price would do if she knew. Marcus almost smiled. It was a careful, contained expression, like a man who had practiced keeping his feelings in their proper place and was beginning to question whether the practice was worth the effort. He came back 2 weeks later on a matter that, upon reflection, he could probably have resolved by correspondence. Ada noticed this but said nothing about it. She was, however, very precise and helpful with the paperwork. On his 5th visit, he asked her if she would like to have supper at the Shoe Fly restaurant on Mayor Street on Friday evening. Ada considered him for a moment. She had made a policy, after certain painful experiences in Missouri, of being very careful about men who wanted things from her. But Marcus Abbott had a quality she had rarely encountered, which was that he did not seem to want anything from her except her company, and he offered this invitation without any performance of expectation whatsoever. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The Shoe Fly was Tucson's finest restaurant, which meant it had tablecloths and the food arrived hot, and the proprietor kept the noise at a level that permitted conversation. Marcus wore a clean shirt and a good coat. Ada wore her blue dress, which had recently benefited from some careful attention with needle and thread. They talked for 2 hours. Ada discovered that Marcus was a man of fewer words than most, but that each word he chose was precisely the right one, and that this was, she found, considerably more attractive than the voluble self-promotion she had encountered in men who talked constantly and said very little. Marcus discovered that Ada had a mind like a well-kept ledger, sharp and organized and honest, and that she had a particular quality of attention when she listened to you that made you feel that what you were saying was genuinely worth hearing. He walked her back to the Butterfield Hotel in the warm September dark. The stars over Tucson were extraordinary, the deep sky brilliance of high desert that you never saw in Missouri. "I have business in town again in 2 weeks, Marcus said at the door of the hotel. "I know," Ada said. "You always do." He looked at her for a long moment in the lamplight from the hotel window. "I would like to call on you properly, Miss Lawson," he said, "if you are amenable." Ada thought about what properly meant to a man like Marcus Abbott, and she thought it meant something serious and considered and lasting, and she thought she was amenable to that in a way she had not been amenable to anything in quite some time. "I am amenable, Mr. Abbott," she said. He came back in 10 days instead of 2 weeks, on the grounds that there was a banking matter that required his attention. Ada was quite sure the banking matter was invented, but she appreciated the effort. They had supper again, and again after that. They walked along the Santa Cruz River in the early evening when the heat had eased, and the cottonwoods turned gold in the late light. Marcus told her about the Cimarron, about the wide grasslands that rolled north toward the mountains, about the way the cattle moved across that land in the mornings when the air was still cool and the light was young. He described it with a restrained love that told Ada this was not just his business but his life's meaning, the thing he had built himself around. "Your family built it," she said. "My father started it," Marcus said, "but I've been running it alone for 4 years. It's mine now as much as it's his, maybe more." "Do you have neighbors out there?" "Some. The Esperanza Ranch to the east, the Harker family to the north. It's open country. You can ride all day and not see another person, which some days is exactly what you want." Ada understood that. She had her own version of it, the particular solitude of being a woman alone in the world, which was not the chosen solitude Marcus described but which had taught her some of the same things. "And what do you want the other days?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the river. The cottonwood leaves caught the last of the evening light and turned it into something fragile and gold. "Company," he said. "The right kind." Ada felt that land somewhere in the region of her sternum, which she took note of. It was during this same period that Ada began to understand the full shape of what was wrong in the land office. It started with the Cimarron. She was copying a transfer document on a Tuesday morning in mid-August when she noticed the date discrepancy. The document transferred 42,000 acres of open grasslands, the same northern grasslands that bordered the Cimarron Ranch on its eastern face, to something called the Consolidated Territorial Land Trust. The transfer was dated August the 3rd. The seal on the document bore the mark of the office of the Surveyor General. Ada had, in her 3 weeks at the land office, become quite familiar with the Surveyor General's seal. She had handled perhaps 30 documents bearing it legitimately. She looked at the seal on this particular document for a long moment. It was slightly off. The pressure was uneven. The outer ring of the seal was faintly blurred on the left side in a way that suggested the stamp had been applied at a slight angle, not by someone in a proper office with a proper press, but by someone doing it hastily on an improvised surface. The depth of the impression was also wrong. She had learned to feel these things in the physical documents, the way you learn to feel the quality of fabric. She did not react. She copied the document with her usual careful precision, and filed it where she was told, and went home that evening and sat in her room at the Butterfield and thought about it for a long time. She thought about Commissioner Holt's smooth smile and the quality of his wool suit. She thought about the Consolidated Territorial Land Trust, which she had never heard of before this document. She thought about 42,000 acres of northern grasslands. She thought about Marcus Abbott describing the Cimarron's eastern boundaries and the open country that rolled away toward the mountains. She was very still, the way she had been still on the boardwalk outside Clement Briggs's boarded-up office, while things arranged themselves into their proper shape in her mind. The next morning she went to work early and, on the pretext of cross-referencing survey numbers, found the original transfer application for the Consolidated Territorial Land Trust. It had been filed on July the 28th by a man named Wallace Pritchard, who, according to his listed address, lived in Denver. She filed this information carefully in her memory. Over the following week, moving slowly and without any appearance of particular interest, she examined several related documents. She found 2 more with seal irregularities. She found a payment authorization made out to a private account at the First National Bank of Arizona Territory, signed by Commissioner Holt. She found a letter, misfiled under the wrong survey number, that referred to the arrangement concluded in Denver, and was signed with initials only. She was building a picture of something large and deliberate and damaging, and the more she built it, the more certain she became that the people at the center of it would not hesitate to be dangerous if they felt threatened. She was also, by this point, well aware that the land being transferred included parcels that directly abutted the Cimarron Ranch, and that if the trust followed the usual pattern of such things, the next step would be to apply pressure on neighboring landowners to sell at depressed prices or face manufactured legal disputes over boundaries and water rights. She needed to tell Marcus. She needed to do it carefully, because she was a single woman working as a clerk with no legal standing and no proof beyond documents that she had accessed only in the course of her legitimate work. And if she misjudged this, she would be dismissed and possibly prosecuted, and the whole scheme would disappear back into the machinery that had produced it. Marcus rode into Tucson on a Thursday, and Ada caught him as he came out of the bank. "I need to speak with you privately," she said, without preamble. "Not here, not tonight at supper, now and somewhere that is not a public place." Marcus looked at her for one moment, reading her expression with the same calm attention he brought to everything, and whatever he read there was enough. "My cousin B lives on Alameda Street," he said. "She keeps a decent house. I can take you there now if she's home." B was home. She was a stout and cheerful woman who took one look at Ada's face and Marcus's, produced coffee, and then made herself scarce in the kitchen with the self-possessed tact of a woman who had seen situations before. Ada sat across from Marcus at the kitchen table and told him everything she had found. She was precise and organized, and she presented the information in the order she had gathered it so that the picture built itself as she spoke. She watched his face as she talked. Marcus was still. He was very good at being still, but this was a different kind of still from his usual considered quiet. This was the stillness of something held under enormous pressure. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. "The Consolidated Territorial Land Trust," he said. "Yes. That land runs along my eastern boundary. The best water access I have to the upper pastures comes through that corridor." "I know," Ada said. "If someone controls that land and decides to be difficult about water access or pushes for a manufactured boundary dispute, I spend the next several years in litigation that I will eventually win, but that will drain the Cimarron dry in the process." "Yes," Ada said again. Marcus looked at her. "You've been carrying this for a week." I wanted to be sure of what I had before I brought it to you. That's he stopped, started again. That was good thinking. I am not finished, Ada said. I think I can get more. There are additional payment records in the files that I have not fully examined. I believe if I can document the financial transfers linking Holt to Pritchard and to whoever is behind the trust in Denver, you will have something that a federal prosecutor can actually work with. The seal irregularities alone will not be enough. Marcus looked at her steadily. You're proposing to keep looking. Yes, that carries risk. I am aware of the risk, Ada said. I am also aware that it is your land and your livelihood, and that you have put 11 years into the Cimarron, and that I am in a position to do something about this if I am careful. He held her gaze for a long moment, and something moved through his expression that was not quite the controlled, restrained manner she had come to know. It was warmer than that and less careful, and it made her chest do something inconvenient. Why? He asked. Simply, just that. Ada thought about the question. Because it is wrong, she said, and because I am tired of watching wrong things happen while the people doing them rely on everyone around them to be too frightened to act. Marcus was quiet again. Then he said, I will go to Prescott. There is a federal marshal there named Cord Haynes who is not on anyone's payroll as far as I know. I'll tell him what you found and see what standing we have. While I do that, you keep looking. But Ada, and this was the first time he had used her given name, and she felt it like a change in the weather, be careful. Men who forge government seals do not become careful when they feel exposed. I know, she said. I mean it. If anything feels wrong, if Holt looks at you differently, if anyone asks questions about what you're doing in those files, you stop immediately and you come to B's house. And if you are in Prescott, then you go to B's house and you wait for me to come back. Ada looked at him steadily. You are being very authoritative about my safety for a man who has known me for approximately 5 weeks. Marcus had the grace to look very slightly abashed, which was not an expression she had seen on his face before and which she found, against her better judgment, enormously endearing. You are correct, he said. I have no authority over your decisions. I am asking you as someone who he stopped, reorganized himself, as someone who values your continued well-being considerably, to be careful. That is much better, Ada said, and yes, I will be careful. He left for Prescott the next morning. Ada went to work. Over the following 10 days, she built the case document by document, working slowly and without any outward change in her usual patterns. She came in at the same time each morning. She ate her lunch at the same time. She left at the same time each evening. She was pleasant and efficient and gave absolutely no indication that she was doing anything other than her assigned work. What she was actually doing was photographing the interior architecture of a fraud. There was a second set of payment records, kept in a separate file labeled simply Survey Correspondence, that contained the financial signatures of the whole arrangement. 6 transfers of funds from an account held by the Consolidated Territorial Land Trust to a private account at the First National, made in amounts of $500 each. The First National account number matched a number she had found in Holt's desk drawer, which she had opened on a morning when Holt was in a meeting with the territory's tax assessor, and she had a legitimate reason to be in his office retrieving a survey file. She wrote everything down in a small notebook she kept in her corset, because she was thorough and she did not trust her memory under pressure. She also found in the misfiled correspondence 2 additional letters. One was from Wallace Pritchard in Denver and referred explicitly to the transfer document to be prepared by our mutual contact, and the seal arrangement as previously discussed. The second was from someone who signed themselves only as R.H., whose language was more oblique but whose reference to the Cimarron situation and our agreed timeline for the boundary action made the intended target absolutely explicit. Ada copied these letters word for word in her notebook, with the original file numbers noted beside each entry. She was almost done. She needed one more thing, the affidavit from a witness to the actual forgery. She had a name. One of the other clerks at the land office, A young man named Percy Dane, who had been there for 2 years and who had the slightly gray, tightly wound look of someone who knew things he wished he did not know, had made a comment one morning casually, too casually, about the Silver Crown Saloon. He had said something about a man named Dix who did work in the back room, and then he had stopped himself and changed the subject. Ada had filed this away. She went to the Silver Crown on a Saturday afternoon, which was the only time it was respectable for a woman to enter a saloon in Tucson, on the grounds that Saturday afternoons in saloons were generally populated by people conducting legitimate business, and she ordered a lemonade and asked the barman if a man named Dix worked there. The barman looked at her for a long moment. He was a large, battered man who had seen everything and was largely unmoved by it. "What kind of work?" he asked. "Document work," Ada said. "Seal work." Another long look. "You a lawyer?" "No, I am trying to stop something wrong from happening to a good man's land." The barman considered this for what felt like a very long time. Then he said, "Dix doesn't work here anymore. He left 3 weeks ago. Went to Tombstone, I heard." "Do you know his full name?" "Dixon Ware. Used to do engraving work." Ada thanked him and left. She sent a wire to Marcus in Prescott. "Have everything NEEDED stop witness named DIXON Ware now in Tombstone stop return when able stop LAWSON." Marcus was back in Tucson 2 days later, having ridden rather harder than was strictly necessary. He arrived at the Butterfield Hotel and Ada met him in Mrs. Price's sitting room, with Mrs. Price diplomatically occupied in her kitchen, and Ada spread her notebook on the table between them and told him everything. Marcus read through her notes with the intense focus of a man processing information that mattered enormously. He read it twice. Then he looked up at her. "Ada," he said. "Yes. This is extraordinary." She felt warmth move through her that she firmly declined to show on her face. "Marshal Haynes. He's coming. He'll be here in 4 days. He's bringing a federal prosecutor named Garrett from Albuquerque. They needed time to arrange proper warrants." Marcus paused. "I told Haynes about the seal irregularities you identified. He said if we can produce a witness who watched the forgery happen, combined with this financial documentation, we have enough to prosecute Holt and potentially Pritchard as well." "Dixon Ware is in Tombstone." "I know. I'm going to Tombstone tomorrow." Ada looked at him. "I am going with you." "Ada, I am the one who found his name. I know what questions to ask, and I am not staying here alone while all of this is unfolding." She held his gaze. "I am going with you." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. "Can you ride?" "I grew up in Missouri. Yes, I can ride. We leave at first light." Tombstone was a day and a half's hard ride southeast, through country that was beautiful and unforgiving in equal measure. The wide Bajada stretching toward the Dragoon Mountains, saguaro cactus standing in the afternoon light like patient sentinels. Ada rode a steady bay mare that the livery provided, and she rode well, with the practical competence of someone who had learned because riding was useful, not because it was fashionable. They camped one night in a dry wash, a small fire, coffee, hard bread and bacon, and the stars above were so thick and brilliant that Ada lay on her bedroll and looked up at them, and felt the whole complicated tangle of her life in Tucson sort itself briefly into a simple and clarifying truth. She was exactly where she needed to be, doing exactly what needed to be done, and beside her, sitting with his coffee and looking at the same stars with that contained, steady quality of attention he brought to everything, was a man she had come to trust completely. "Do you ever think about what comes after?" she asked. "After all of this?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The Cimarron," he said. "Just the Cimarron without this." "That sounds peaceful." "It is." He looked at her. The firelight made his face warm and close. "What do you think about after?" Ada considered this honestly. "I think about having somewhere that is mine, some fixed point." "Missouri?" "No, not Missouri." She did not elaborate on what Missouri had held and what it had cost her, but she thought he probably understood. They were quiet for a while. The fire popped softly. Somewhere in the dark a coyote called and another answered, and then the desert was silent again. "Ada," Marcus said. "Yes." "When this is finished, When Holt is dealt with and the Cimarron is safe." He stopped. This was, she had learned, what happened when he was choosing his words very carefully. "I would like to ask you something." "Ask me now," she said. "Not yet," he said. "When it is finished. When there is nothing urgent between the question and the answer." Ada looked at the stars. "All right," she said. "When it is finished." They found Dixon Ware in Tombstone the next afternoon in a small room above a bootmaker's shop on 5th Street. He was a slight man in his 40s with the nervous, compressed energy of someone who had been frightened for a long time. When Marcus told him what they knew, Ware's face went through several rapid expressions before settling on something that looked like exhausted relief. "I told Pritchard I wouldn't do it," Ware said. "I told him what he was asking was a federal crime. He told me that was my problem and gave me $200 and said if I talked about it I would not talk about anything else afterward." "He threatened you," Ada said. "Yes, ma'am, directly and specifically." Ware looked at Marcus. "I had nothing to do with the land fraud itself. I made a seal stamp. I pressed it onto a document I was handed in the back room of the Silver Crown Saloon on the night of August the 2nd. The man who handed me the document was Gerald Holt." Marcus and Ada exchanged a look. "Will you say that in front of a federal prosecutor?" Marcus asked. Ware was quiet for a long moment. "Will there be protection?" "Marshal Cord Haynes is coming from Prescott with federal backing. The prosecutor's name is Garrett. If you testify to what you just told us, Haynes will arrange safe transport to Albuquerque and you will have the full backing of the federal court." Ware looked at his hands. Then he looked at Ada, and she held his gaze steadily, and there was something in her expression, not force, not pressure, but a clear and honest recognition of what this cost him and what it was worth, that seemed to settle something in him. "Yes," he said, "I will testify." They rode back to Tucson in 2 days, arriving on the morning of September the 20th, which was the morning that Marshal Cord Haynes and Prosecutor James Garrett arrived from the north on the Southern Pacific. The meeting took place in a private room at the Butterfield Hotel, which Mrs. Price provided without a word and without a question, and with the addition of coffee and a covered plate of biscuits, which was her particular way of contributing to justice. Ada presented her evidence methodically. She had organized her notebook into 3 sections: the financial transfers with dates and account numbers, the correspondence establishing the conspiracy between Holt and Pritchard, and the documentary evidence of the seal forgery, along with Dixon Ware's account of the night of August the 2nd. Prosecutor Garrett, a lean and precise man from Albuquerque, listened without expression and read everything twice. Marshal Haynes, a weathered veteran with a reputation for absolute personal integrity, asked 2 questions. "This woman gathered all of this?" Garrett asked, not dismissively but with genuine surprise. "She did," Marcus said. Garrett looked at Ada. "You understand that you took considerable personal risk here?" "I understand that," Ada said. "I also understand that without this documentation, you would have a difficult time establishing the conspiracy rather than just the forgery. The seal irregularity alone might be argued as accidental. The financial transfers and the correspondence cannot be." Garrett looked at her for another moment. "You are correct," he said. "This is exceptional work." Ada did not perform false modesty. "Thank you." The plan was set. Marshal Haynes would go to the land office the following morning with the warrant for Holt's arrest. Marcus would come as well, both because he had standing as the owner of the property most directly threatened, and because he had the affidavit from the Santa Fe clerk confirming the Surveyor General's absence on August the 3rd, which Garrett had arranged to have obtained during the Prescott discussions. Ada would remain at the Butterfield. She did not argue with this because she understood the logic. Her value had been in building the case. The confrontation with Holt was a legal procedure that required specific people in specific roles. She was not one of them, but she did not sleep well. She was awake before dawn, sitting in the chair by her window and watching the sky go from black to dark blue to the pale, luminous gray of early Arizona morning. She thought about Marcus standing in that office making his accusation, and she thought about how much was riding on it. Not just the Cimarron, but the principle of the thing. The idea that someone in a position of federal trust could steal 42,000 acres of land from the people who lived beside it, and count on silence and complexity to protect him. She also, entirely against her will, thought about what Marcus had said by the fire. When this is finished, I would like to ask you something. The question was very obvious, she thought, and she knew her answer. She had known her answer before she went to Tombstone. She had probably known it before that. In the land office, things were happening with the particular compressed, electric quality of a moment that has been building for a long time. Marcus had arrived with Marshal Haynes and Prosecutor Garrett at 8 o'clock in the morning. The office was already open, because Holt was a man who valued the appearance of industry. He was behind his mahogany desk when the door opened. Marcus had not planned to lead with the desk. He had planned to let Haynes and Garrett handle it in their orderly, legal way. But the sight of Holt sitting there, comfortable and smooth and entirely confident in his own protection, had produced a surge of something volcanic in Marcus's chest, and his fist had hit the desk before the plan had fully presented itself. "That transfer carries a forged seal," Marcus said, "and I will prove it today." The deputies reached for their holsters. Marshal Haynes produced his badge and his warrant in one smooth, practiced motion, and the room rearranged itself around those two objects with the absolute efficiency that federal authority commands when properly deployed. "Gerald Holt," Haynes said, in the flat, carrying voice of a man who has done this many times and finds no drama in it, "I am placing you under arrest under warrant of the federal court of the territory of Arizona on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and the forgery of a federal government document." Holt's smooth composure fractured completely. He stood up behind his desk, and he looked at Marcus Abbott with an expression that contained several things in rapid succession: shock, calculation, rage, and then, finally, the particular gray resignation of a man who knows the game is over. "You have nothing," Holt said, but his voice had lost its authority. "We have your bank account records," Marcus said. "We have the correspondence from Pritchard. We have a witness who watched you hand a forged sealed document in the back room of the Silver Crown Saloon on the night of August the 2nd. He stepped forward, and his voice was very quiet. "We have everything." Holt was arrested. The deputies, who proved to be practical men without strong loyalty to their employer, stepped back and did not interfere. The other clerk stood in stunned silence. Percy Dane, the young clerk who had given Ada the thread that led to Dixon Ware, sat down very heavily in his chair and put his face in his hands, and Marshal Haynes noticed this and made a note. Prosecutor Garrett spent the next several hours in the records room, systematically securing the documentation, and what he found there confirmed and exceeded what Ada had assembled. There was a third set of letters. There was a complete financial ledger, not the fragments Ada had found but the full record of the scheme, kept, inexplicably, in a locked box in the bottom of a filing cabinet, as if Holt had believed that a locked box was sufficient security for a federal crime. He thought he was untouchable, Haynes said, over dinner that evening at the Shoe Fly, where Marcus had brought Ada and Bea and Mrs. Price, because it seemed to him that the people who had helped the most should eat the best meal available. Men like Holt always do. They believe their position is its own protection. "It often is," Ada said, "in places where no one is paying attention." "You were paying attention," Garrett said. Ada looked at Marcus across the table. "I had reason to." Marcus looked back at her. The conversation continued around them, Haynes explaining the probable timeline for prosecution, Garrett describing the process for formally voiding the fraudulent transfer and restoring the land to public status, Bea asking detailed questions about whether Pritchard in Denver would also be charged, which he would. Marcus and Ada said nothing for a moment, but they held each other's eyes in the warm lamplight of the Shoe Fly restaurant, and everything that had been building for 6 weeks said itself without words. It was later, much later, when they had walked Mrs. Price home and then be home, and the night was cool and the street was quiet, that Marcus stopped walking. Ada stopped too and turned to face him. "When it was finished," he said. "I said I would ask you something when it was finished." "I remember," she said. "It is finished now. It appears so." He looked at her in the darkness, this tall, still man who had ridden hard and spoken true and handed his trust to her as naturally as if it were something he had always planned to do. The stars were enormous overhead. The desert air smelled of dust and something faintly sweet she had learned was creosote after rain. "Ada Lawson," Marcus said, "I would like you to marry me." Ada breathed in. Then out. "Marcus Abbott," she said. "Yes." He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in the dark street of Tucson on a September night in 1883, and it was not at all what a romantic novel would have prescribed, no grand gesture, no trembling declaration, but it was absolutely true, and in Ada's experience, the things that were absolutely true were the things that lasted. He kissed her then, his hand coming up to her face with a gentleness that surprised her, given that he was a large man who worked with his hands and handled large animals and had spent the morning slamming his fist on federal desks. But his hands on her face were extraordinarily careful, as if she were something that mattered enormously, and she kissed him back with all the directness and honest conviction that was simply her nature. They married 6 weeks later in Tucson, on a clear November morning in the small adobe church on Mayer Street, with Mrs. Price and B, and a collection of Tucson residents who had followed the Holt affair with considerable interest, and had developed opinions about the two people at the center of it. Marshal Haynes came back for the occasion, which was a thing he did not generally do, and Prosecutor Garrett sent flowers from Albuquerque, which arrived slightly wilted but were received with genuine appreciation. Ada wore a dress that was not blue, because B had insisted on taking her to the finest dressmaker in Tucson, and the result was a cream-colored walking dress with a fitted jacket that B said made her look formidable and beautiful in equal measure, which Ada decided to take as a compliment. Marcus wore a dark suit that fit him remarkably well for a man who spent most of his time in range clothes, and when Ada came down the steps of the Butterfield Hotel to meet him, he looked at her with an expression that had nothing controlled or restrained about it, pure and uncomplicated and deeply warm, and Ada felt it all the way through. The ceremony was brief, and the reception was cheerful and loud, and involved a great deal of very good food contributed by various members of the Tucson community, who seemed to feel a collective ownership over the occasion. By December, Ada had left the land office, which was being reorganized under a temporary commissioner sent from Washington while the prosecution of Holt proceeded, and had gone with Marcus to the Cimarron. She had ridden north with him through 3 days of country that expanded and deepened with every mile, the Bajada giving way to higher grasslands, the mountains drawing closer and becoming more particular, the sky becoming, somehow, even larger. When they crested the last ridge and Marcus stopped the horses and she saw the Cimarron for the first time, the wide valley with its golden winter grass and the ranch buildings below, and the cattle moving slowly in the far distance, she understood what he had meant when he described it with that contained love. It was his life's meaning, and now it was hers. The ranch house was a long adobe structure that had been added to over the years, solid and functional and needing. Ada assessed immediately, a woman's particular organizing attention, which she proceeded to give it with quiet and thoroughgoing efficiency over the following weeks. Marcus watched her reorganize the house with the expression of a man observing something very competent do exactly what it was designed to do, and occasionally he would stop and simply look at her, and she would catch him at it, and he would not look away. "You are staring," she told him one morning when she was going through the supply inventories at the kitchen table. "Yes," he agreed with no apparent intention of stopping. She put the inventories down. "Come here, then," she said. He came, and she put her hands on either side of his face, this steady, good man who had built something real and defended it honestly, and she kissed him with the same directness she brought to everything else she did. The Cimarron prospered through the winter. Marcus had two hands who had worked the ranch for years, Gus and Tomaz, both reliable and experienced and both thoroughly approving of Ada from the first week, primarily because she made biscuits on Sunday mornings that Gus said were the finest thing that had ever happened to the ranch, and because she paid attention to the horses in a way that Tomaz, who loved the horses very specifically and carefully, recognized and respected. The fraudulent transfer was formally voided by federal order in February of 1884. Prosecutor Garrett wrote to advise them of the outcome. Gerald Holt had been convicted of fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 7 years in the federal penitentiary. Wallace Pritchard in Denver had been arrested, tried in Colorado, and sentenced to 5 years. The man behind the initials RH had been identified as a railroad investor named Roland Hadley, who had been funding the scheme with the intention of acquiring the grassland corridor for a planned rail spur. Hadley's case was still working its way through the federal courts, Garrett wrote, but the documentation Ada had found made the outcome all but certain. Dixon Ware, whose testimony had been essential, had been granted immunity and had relocated, with a small sum provided by the federal court, to California, where he had taken up an honest trade in engraving and portrait printing in Sacramento. Percy Dane, who had technically known about the fraud and not reported it, had been given a conditional arrangement by the court. He would testify against Holt and Pritchard and would receive no criminal charge in exchange. He was young and had been genuinely frightened, and the prosecutor had exercised his discretion accordingly. Percy had subsequently left Tucson for his family's farm in New Mexico, which seemed, Garrett wrote with a trace of dry humor, the most sensible decision Percy had made in some time. Marcus read the letter out loud at the kitchen table on a February morning while Ada poured coffee. When he finished, he folded it carefully and set it on the table. "It is done," he said. Ada set the coffee pot down and looked at the letter. There was something vast in the fact of its doneness, the full resolution of the thing they had set in motion on a September morning with a desk and a fist and an absolute certainty. "Yes," she said, "completely done." Marcus reached across the table and took her hand. "We are going to be fine," he said. Ada smiled at him. In the 4 months she had been at the Cimarron, she had come to believe that this was not merely optimism but an accurate description of what was happening. "We are already fine," she said. She was carrying their first child by spring. Marcus received this information in the kitchen on an April morning, when Ada told him directly and without any performance, because she did not have a performative bone in her body, that she believed they would be expecting a baby in October. Marcus sat down. This was the only time Ada had ever seen him sit down in response to information rather than by intention. Then he stood up again and crossed the kitchen and pulled her into his arms with a careful, encompassing warmth that she pressed herself into completely. They stood in the kitchen for a long time while the morning light moved across the floor and the horses moved in the corral outside. "A boy," Marcus said into her hair. "Or a girl." "One of those two options," Ada agreed, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "I favor those odds." He made a sound that she had come to identify as his version of a laugh, contained and quiet but entirely genuine. The pregnancy was healthy and straightforward, because Ada was a healthy and straightforward person who handled difficulty with practical efficiency. She rode until she could not comfortably, and then she directed the ranch operations from the kitchen table with a thoroughness that both impressed and slightly amused Marcus. She had developed strong opinions about the summer grazing rotation and was entirely correct about them, a fact that Gus acknowledged with his particular combination of grumpiness and respect. The summer brought visitors. Marshal Cord Haynes came through on a routing matter and stayed 2 nights and sat on the porch with Marcus in the evenings, the two men talking in the comfortable, sparse way of men who respected each other. He brought news that Roland Hadley had been convicted in Denver and would serve 4 years, and that the federal government was conducting a broader review of land transfers in the territory, specifically because of what the Cimarron case had exposed about the mechanisms of this kind of fraud. "Your wife's work," Haynes said to Marcus on the second evening. "She would not thank you for calling it that," Marcus said. "She would say it was the obvious thing to do." "Most people who could see the obvious thing would still not do it," Haynes said. Marcus looked out at the grasslands in the evening light. "No," he said, "they would not." Bee came to stay in August, which was an enormous and cheerful presence in the ranch house. She had opinions about every aspect of the baby's anticipated arrival and expressed them all with great confidence and warmth. Ada received each opinion with the particular patient expression she reserved for people she was genuinely fond of, but who were not always strictly practical. The baby was born on October the 14th, 1884. He was a boy, 9 pounds and furious about the whole business, with Marcus's dark hair and Ada's gray eyes, and a set of lungs that suggested he would have strong feelings about things throughout his life. They named him James Henry Abbott, James for Ada's father, who had been a decent man, and Henry for Marcus's, who had built the Cimarron from nothing and left something worth continuing. James Henry Abbott was taken out to the corral on his 4th day of life because his father thought he should see the horses, and he stared at them with the round, serious gaze of a baby who is processing an enormous amount of information. And one of the mares pressed her nose gently against his face, and Marcus stood there holding his son in the October sun, and felt something that went so far beyond what he had words for that he simply let it be wordless. Ada watched this from the corral fence and loved both of them with a directness and completeness that she would not have thought possible 3 years ago, when she had been standing outside a dead man's office in the August heat with a carpetbag and a letter addressed to no one. Life on the Cimarron settled into the rhythms that are the particular beauty of ranch life. The working rhythm of early mornings and full days, the seasonal rhythm of the cattle and the grass and the water, the quiet domestic rhythm of 2 people building something together who have the enormous good fortune to actually like each other and to find each other interesting. Marcus was a better rancher with Ada than without her. She had a talent for the financial and logistical side of things that complemented his ability with the land and the animals, and between them, they managed the Cimarron with a competence and care that began to show in the quality of their herd and the health of the land. They were known in the region as fair dealers, people who paid what they owed and expected what was owed them, and this reputation, built slowly and without fanfare, was the kind of capital that compounded. Young James grew from a furious infant to a determined toddler who seemed to share his mother's conviction that the obvious thing was always worth doing. By 18 months, he was following Gus around the barn with a focused intentionality that made the old hand laugh, which was not something Gus did freely, and this became one of the small joys of the ranch. In the spring of 1886, Ada told Marcus she was expecting again, and this time he did not sit down, but instead immediately began reorganizing the house in his head in a way that she found both unnecessary and deeply endearing. Their second child was a girl, born in December, dark-haired and quiet and observant from the beginning. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that it suited her, and they both agreed on it within approximately 30 seconds of seeing her, which Marcus said was the fastest they had ever agreed on anything, which Ada disputed, citing the transfer of land records as something on which they had agreed very quickly. "That was not agreement," Marcus said, holding Clara while Ada rested. "That was you telling me what was going to happen." "And you agreeing," Ada said. "And me agreeing," he admitted, looking down at his daughter, who was looking at him with the alert, considering gaze of someone assessing a new situation. James was enormously interested in Clara in the proprietary way of older siblings. He placed himself as her primary guardian within the first week, and took this role very seriously, which required monitoring by both parents since his supervision occasionally involved levels of affection that exceeded Clara's tolerance. The years passed with the good weight of years that are actually lived rather than simply survived. The Cimarron grew. The cattle were good. Gus stayed on until he retired, at which point Marcus built him a small house at the edge of the property, and he lived there contentedly, teaching James every useful thing he knew, which was considerable. Tomás stayed longer still, eventually bringing his brother to work alongside him, and the ranch became a small community in the way that the best ranches do. Marcus expanded the northern pastures in 1887, negotiating the purchase of a parcel from the Harker family to the north, who were consolidating their own operation. The grasslands that had once been at the center of the fraud were now formally registered as public grazing land. Protected from private transfer by the new regulations the federal government had implemented in the wake of the Holt prosecution, which had been used in congressional testimony as a case study in the vulnerabilities of the territorial land transfer system. Ada, who had given that testimony via written statement to a federal committee in 1885, had received a formal letter of commendation from the Office of the Attorney General, which she kept in a box with other important papers and did not talk about. Mrs. Price came to visit in the summer of 1887, having finally retired from the Butterfield Hotel, and sold it to a very competent young woman from San Francisco. She arrived on the Southern Pacific to Tucson, and Marcus drove the wagon down to collect her, and she rode north to the Cimarron, talking steadily for 3 hours and examining the landscape with the interest of a woman who had heard about it for years and was now comparing the reality to the description. "It is exactly as he described it," she told Ada, when they arrived at the ranch and James ran to inspect the wagon and Clara sat on the porch watching with her customary careful attention. "He described it accurately. He generally does," Ada said. Mrs. Price stayed 3 weeks and adored the children unreservedly and told Marcus every evening at dinner a story from Tucson that he had not heard, and he listened with his full and genuine attention in the way he always gave to things that were worth hearing. She went back to Tucson refreshed and full of opinions about ranch life that she would share with anyone who asked. Bea became a regular fixture at the Cimarron, visiting several times a year and developing a relationship with Clara in particular that was warm and full of the specific jokes and observations of two people who find each other funny in the same ways. James preferred to follow Marcus or Gus or Tomás and learn things that involved horses or cattle or the wide working life of the ranch, and Clara preferred to read and to talk to Bea and to watch things with her grave and thorough attention. Marcus bought Ada a good writing desk in 1888, having noticed that she was conducting a correspondence with the Federal Land Records Office on her own initiative, helping to identify irregularities in transfer documents that the new oversight system flagged for review. She had become, without particularly intending to, a recognized expert in the specific technical signatures of forged government seals. She did this work carefully and methodically and without any desire for recognition, which meant that the people who worked with her respected her enormously. "You are building something," Marcus said one evening, watching her at the desk by the window. "I am helping them not destroy what others have built," she said without looking up. "There is a difference." "Is there?" She looked up then, and the lamp made her face warm and particular, this face he had learned over 5 years to read as well as he read the weather on the mountains. "What I am building," she said, "is here." He crossed the room and put his hand on her shoulder, and she reached up and put her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a moment while the wind moved over the Cimarron grass outside. In 1889, Arizona Territory was moving toward statehood in the way these things move, slowly and with considerable political noise. Marcus paid close attention to this because statehood would mean new land law and new court jurisdictions, and he spent a good deal of time corresponding with other ranchers about the specific implications. Ada read all the relevant legislation and offered opinions that were precise and specific and nearly always correct, which Marcus had ceased to be surprised by. The third child came in the spring of 1890, another boy, which James regarded with serious fraternal consideration, and Clara regarded with somewhat warmer interest, being at an age where babies were fascinating rather than merely loud. This one came into the world with an easy cheerfulness that seemed to be simply his nature, and they named him Thomas, for Tamaz, who had been at the Cimarron for 7 years by then, and was genuinely moved by this. Thomas Abbott was a sunny and social child who liked everyone he met and was liked in return, which was a gift of a different kind than his siblings' particular intensities, but no less valuable. By 1891, the Cimarron had grown into one of the finest cattle operations in the territory. Not the largest, but well regarded for the quality of the stock and the integrity of the management. Marcus was known at the territorial stockmen's meetings as a man who said what he meant and could be trusted to stand behind it, and this was, in a business where handshakes still carried the weight of contracts, an invaluable reputation. He still rode out most mornings at first light, and Ada still got up at first light as well, not from duty, but because she had become, over 8 years in the desert, an early light person, attuned to the particular quality of morning in high country where the air was cold and clear, and the light came in at an angle that made everything simple and exact. They would sit sometimes on the porch in that early morning with coffee before the children needed them and before the work of the day began, just sitting in the cool quiet. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked her once on such a morning. "The work in Tucson, the investigation." Ada considered this honestly. "The work itself was interesting," she said, "but what I miss is not a thing that no longer exists. The land records work I am doing now is continuous with it. It is the same problem approached differently." "That is a philosophical answer." "It is an accurate answer," she said. "What do you mean by missing something? If the essence of the thing is still present in a different form, is it missing?" Marcus thought about this. He was good at thinking about things. "Do you miss the urgency of it?" "Sometimes," she admitted. "The feeling when something is at risk and you are the one who might be able to prevent it. There was a kind of clarity in that." "The Cimarron was at risk," he said. "You prevented it, and now it is not at risk," she said. "Which is the correct outcome?" He looked at her sideways. "You could probably find something else to prevent." She laughed, which was one of the things he treasured most. The way her laughter was always surprised out of her, as if she could not quite believe she had been made to laugh. "I have 3 children and 42,000 adjacent acres of federal grassland to keep an eye on," she said. "That is quite enough." James turned 7 in 1891, and Marcus began teaching him to ride seriously, not the gentle pony rides of earlier years but real riding, on a proper horse with proper attention to the animal's communication. James took to it with the grave and focused intensity he brought to everything, and by that summer he could ride a full circuit of the home pastures without supervision. Clara at 5 was interested in the horses, but more interested in the books Ada had begun bringing back from Tucson on her occasional trips, and in the school lessons that Ada conducted each morning at the kitchen table with an efficiency that made the 2 older children genuinely learn. Marcus sat in on these lessons sometimes, on the grounds that there were things Ada taught that he found he had not known or had forgotten, and she never made him feel that this was odd. There was a school established in the nearest town, Amos Creek, 8 miles to the south, by 1892, and James attended it from the age of 8. He rode there himself by the time he was 9, on the steady gray horse Marcus had selected for him with the precise assessment of a man who had spent 20 years reading horses. The territory became the state of Arizona in 1912, but that is getting ahead of things. What mattered in the years of the Cimarron's building was the daily accumulation of a life that was genuinely good, not in the way of fairy tales, which Ada had never much believed in, but in the real and substantial way of things that are honestly built. There were hard years. A drought in 1893 that was brutal and required brutal decisions about the herd and the grazing. A fever that went through the household in 1894 and frightened them badly before it passed without permanent consequence. A dispute with a mining company in 1895 over water rights to a spring on the north boundary, which Marcus handled with the same calm, grounded certainty he had brought to Commissioner Holt's office in 1883, and which was resolved in the Cimarron's favor through the territorial court. Ada handled that case's documentation herself, and the attorney who argued it told Marcus afterward that the brief Ada had prepared was the clearest and most usable set of supporting documents he had encountered in 20 years of practice. She should have been an attorney, the man said. Tell her that, Marcus said. She told me she had thought about it, the attorney said, and had decided the law needed better record keepers more than it needed more attorneys. That sounds right, Marcus said. In 1896, Marcus and Ada rode north together on a clear October morning and climbed to the ridge above the ranch, the same ridge where he had stopped the horses on the day he brought her home. They left the children with Tomaz's wife, who had come to live at the ranch when she and Tomaz married and was one of the most practically capable people Ada had ever met. They climbed to the ridge and looked out over the grasslands in the October light, which was gold and absolute and stretched to the mountains in every direction. Marcus said nothing for a long time. Ada stood beside him with her shoulder against his arm and looked at the same thing he was looking at. My father picked this ridge, Marcus said finally. He said you could see the whole thing from here, what it was and what it could be. He was right, Ada said. I used to come up here alone, Marcus said. When I was running the ranch after he died and it was hard in ways I did not know how to talk about, I would come up here and just look at it. And now, she asked. He turned and looked at her, this man who had been alone with hard things for a long time before she had appeared outside a dead man's office with her carpetbag and her controlled composure, and his expression was the open, warm, entirely unguarded expression she had learned to love most. Now it is better, he said. She leaned into him, and his arm came around her, and they stood on the ridge above the Cimarron in the October light, and the grass moved in the wind below them like something breathing. There would be more years. James grew into a serious, capable young man who understood both the land and the law with the complementary instincts of a person shaped by two very particular parents. Clara became the teacher at the Amos Creek School in 1905. At the age of 18, a position she held with the same grave and thorough care she had brought to watching everything since infancy. Thomas, sunny and social, ended up in the cattle trade in a different capacity, as a buyer and dealer, traveling the territory and then the state with the cheerful competence of someone who genuinely liked people and understood cattle. But before all of that, there was the ordinary magnificent dailiness of the Cimarron in those years, the mornings and evenings and seasons, the particular quality of their life together. Marcus Abbott, who had spent his early years building something alone and defending it alone and carrying the weight of it alone, did not carry it alone anymore. He had a partner who was his equal in every way that mattered and his complement in the specific ways that made a partnership between two distinct people something greater than either alone. He thought about this sometimes with a clarity that surprised him, the clean recognition of an enormous piece of luck. Not accidental luck, the luck of the man who plants seeds in good ground and works the soil, and then receives the harvest as something earned rather than found. But luck nonetheless. Ada, who had spent her early years moving carefully through a world that frequently did not have room for a woman who thought clearly and acted directly, had found a place that not only had room but was actively better for her presence. She had built this place together with Marcus, from the reorganized kitchen and the supply inventories, to the federal correspondence, to the 3 children who were growing into people worth knowing. She thought of it sometimes in those terms, built, the way the Cimarron itself was built, from intention and work and the steady commitment to make the thing real. She had come west with a carpetbag and a letter addressed to a dead man, and she had found, or rather made, a life that was exactly what a life should be. On an evening in the early fall, some years after all the urgency had passed, and the Cimarron was what it was, and the children were growing, and the case that had started it all was long settled and filed away in federal records in Albuquerque, Marcus and Ada sat on the porch as they often did, with coffee, watching the last of the light leave the mountains. "James asked me today what it was like," Marcus said. "When we went to Tombstone, he has heard the story, but he wanted to know what it actually felt like." Ada smiled. "What did you tell him?" "I told him it felt urgent and frightening and extremely important," Marcus said, "and that his mother rode very well." Ada laughed. "That was your primary memory." "It was a notable detail," Marcus said, with the contained, genuine humor she had loved since the first time she had glimpsed it. "We were riding through the Dragoons and you were completely comfortable and I was supposed to be the rancher. You were fine. You were better," he said. She set her coffee cup down and looked at the mountains, which were the deep purple of late evening now, enormous and patient and permanent. "What else did you tell him?" "That the most important thing that happened that summer was not the fraud or the arrest or the prosecution," Marcus said. "It was that I met his mother outside a dead man's office on an August morning and noticed that she was completely still while everything else was in motion." Ada was quiet for a moment. The mountains held their color. Somewhere inside, Thomas was talking to someone, probably to himself, which he did when he was working something out. Clara was reading. James was in the barn. "That is a good answer," Ada said. "I thought so," Marcus said. He reached out across the space between their chairs and put his hand on hers where it rested on the arm of her chair. She turned her hand and took his. They sat like that until the light was entirely gone from the mountains and the stars began. The same extravagant, brilliant stars that had covered them the night they camped in the dry wash, and Marcus had said he wanted to ask her something. And she had said to wait until it was finished. And he had waited. And then it had been finished, and he had asked. And she had said yes. And everything since had been the consequence of that one true thing. The Cimarron was quiet. The grass moved in the night wind. The horses were settled. Inside, a child's voice stopped, and then there was the deep and particular silence of a house where people are content. Marcus squeezed her hand once. She squeezed back. The stars multiplied overhead, and the night opened wide over the grasslands, and the Cimarron ranch held its ground, solid and built and lasting, exactly as it should be.